Part 1e of Auguste Comte and Positivism. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Auguste Comte and Positivism, by John Stuart Mill. Part 1e. The state of sociological speculation being such as has been described, divided between a feudal and theological school, now effete, and a democratic and metaphysical one, of no value except for the destruction of the former. The problem, how to render the social science positive, must naturally have presented itself, more or less distinctly, to superior minds. M. Comte examines and criticizes, for the most part justly, some of the principal efforts which have been made by individual thinkers for this purpose. But the weak side of his philosophy comes out prominently in his strictures on the only systematic attempt yet made by any body of thinkers to constitute a science, not indeed of social phaenomena generally, but of one great class or division of them. We mean, of course, political economy, which, with a reservation in favour of the speculations of Adam Smith as valuable preparatory studies for science, he deems unscientific, unpositive, and a mere branch of metaphysics, that comprehensive category of condemnation in which he places all attempts at positive science which are not, in his opinion, directed by a right scientific method. Any one acquainted with the writings of political economists need only read his few pages of animadversions on them, 193-205, to learn how extremely superficial M. Comte can sometimes be. He affirms that they have added nothing really new to the original aperçu of Adam Smith, when every one who has read them knows that they have added so much as to have changed the whole aspect of the science, besides rectifying and clearing up in the most essential points the aperçus themselves. He lays an almost puerile stress, for the purpose of disparagement, on the discussions about the meaning of words which are found in the best books on political economy, as if such discussions were not an indispensable accompaniment of the progress of thought, and abundant in the history of every physical science. On the whole question he has but one remark of any value, and that he misapplies, namely, that the study of the conditions of national wealth as a detached subject is unphilosophical, because, all the different aspects of social phaenomena acting and reacting on one another, they cannot be rightly understood apart; which by no means proves that the material and industrial phaenomena of society are not, even by themselves, susceptible of useful generalizations, but only that these generalizations must necessarily be relative to a given form of civilization and a given stage of social advancement. This, we apprehend, is what no political economist would deny. None of them pretend that the laws of wages, profits, values, prices, and the like, set down in their treatises, would be strictly true, or many of them true at all, in the savage state, for example, or in a community composed of masters and slaves. But they do think, with good reason, that whoever understands the political economy of a country with the complicated and manifold civilization of the nations of Europe, can deduce without difficulty the political economy of any other state of society, with the particular circumstances of which he is equally well acquainted. M. Littré, who, though a warm admirer, and accepting the position of a disciple of M. Comte, is singularly free from his errors, makes the equally ingenious and just remark, that political economy corresponds in social science to the theory of the nutritive functions in biology, which M. Comte, with all good physiologists, thinks it not only permissible but a great and fundamental improvement to treat, in the first place, separately, as the necessary basis of the higher branches of the science. Although the nutritive functions can no more be withdrawn, in fact, from the influence of the animal and human attributes, than the economical phaenomena of society from that of the political and moral. We do not pretend that political economy has never been prosecuted or taught in a contracted spirit. As often as a study is cultivated by narrow minds, they will draw from it narrow conclusions. If a political economist is deficient in general knowledge, he will exaggerate the importance and universality of the limited class of truths which he knows. All kinds of scientific men are liable to this imputation. and M. Comte is never weary of urging it against them, reproaching them with their narrowness of mind, the petty scale of their thoughts, their incapacity for large views, and the stupidity of those they occasionally attempt beyond the bounds of their own subjects. Political economists do not deserve these reproaches more than other classes of positive inquirers, but less than most. The principal error of narrowness with which they are frequently chargeable is that of regarding, not any economical doctrine, but their present experience of mankind, as of universal validity, mistaking temporary or local phases of human character for human nature itself, having no faith in the wonderful pliability of the human mind, deeming it impossible, in spite of the strongest evidence, that the earth can produce human beings of a different type from that which is familiar to them in their own age, or even, perhaps, in their own country. The only security against this narrowness is a liberal mental cultivation, and all it proves is that a person is not likely to be a good political economist who is nothing else. Thus far we have had to do with M. Comte as a sociologist only in his critical capacity. We have now to deal with him as a constructor, the author of a sociological system. The first question is that of the method proper to the study. His view of this is highly instructive. The method proper to the science of society must be, in substance, the same as in all other sciences: the interrogation and interpretation of experience, by the twofold process of induction and deduction. But its mode of practising these operations has features of peculiarity. In general, induction furnishes to science the laws of the elementary facts, from which, when known, those of the complex combinations are thought out deductively. Specific observation of complex phaemomena yields no general laws, or only empirical ones. Its scientific function is to verify the laws obtained by deduction. This mode of philosophizing is not adequate to the exigencies of sociological investigation. In social phaemomena the elementary facts are feelings and actions, and the laws of these are the laws of human nature, social facts being the results of human acts and situations. Since, then, the phaemomena of man in society result from his nature as an individual being, it might be thought that the proper mode of constructing a positive social science must be by deducing it from the general laws of human nature, using the facts of history merely for verification. Such, accordingly, has been the conception of social science by many of those who have endeavoured to render it positive, particularly by the school of Bentham. M. Comte considers this as an error. We may, he says, draw from the universal laws of human nature some conclusions, though even these we think rather precarious, concerning the very earliest stages of human progress, of which there are either no, or very imperfect, historical records. But as society proceeds in its development, its phaemomena are determined, more and more, not by the simple tendencies of universal human nature, but by the accumulated influence of past generations over the present. The human beings themselves, on the laws of whose nature the facts of history depend, are not abstract or universal, but historical human beings, already shaped, and made what they are by human society. This being the case, no powers of deduction could enable any one, starting from the mere conception of the being man, placed in a world such as the earth may have been before the commencement of human agency, to predict and calculate the phaemomena of his development such as they have in fact proved. If the facts of history, empirically considered, had not given rise to any generalizations, a deductive study of history could never have reached higher than more or less plausible conjecture. By good fortune, for the case might easily have been otherwise, the history of our species, looked at as a comprehensive whole, does exhibit a determinate course, a certain order of development, though history alone cannot prove this to be a necessary law as distinguished from a temporary accident. Here, therefore, begins the office of biology, or, as we should say, of psychology, in the social science. The universal laws of human nature are part of the data of sociology, but in using them we must reverse the method of the deductive physical sciences. For while in these specific experience commonly serves to verify laws arrived at by deduction, In sociology, it is specific experience which suggests the laws, and deduction which verifies them. If a sociological theory, collected from historical evidence, contradicts the established general laws of human nature, if, to use M. Comte's instances, it implies in the mass of mankind any very decided natural bent, either in a good or in a bad direction, if it supposes that the reason in average human beings predominates over the desires, or the disinterested desires over the personal, we may know that history has been misinterpreted, and that the theory is false. On the other hand, if laws of social phaenomena, empirically generalized from history, can when once suggested be affiliated to the known laws of human nature, if the direction actually taken by the developments and changes of human society can be seen to be such as the properties of man and of his dwelling place made antecedently probable, the empirical generalizations are raised into positive laws, and sociology becomes a science. Much has been said and written for centuries past, by the practical or empirical school of politicians, in condemnation of theories founded on principles of human nature, without an historical basis; and the theorists, in their turn, have successfully retaliated on the practicalists. But we know not any thinker who, before M. Comte, had penetrated to the philosophy of the matter, and placed the necessity of historical studies as the foundation of sociological speculation on the true footing. From this time, any political thinker who fancies himself able to dispense with a connected view of the great facts of history, as a chain of causes and effects, must be regarded as below the level of the age; while the vulgar mode of using history, by looking in it for parallel cases, as if any cases were parallel, or as if a single instance, or even many instances, not compared and analysed, could reveal a law, will be more than ever and irrevocably discredited. The inversion of the ordinary relation between deduction and induction is not the only point in which, according to M. Comte, the method proper to sociology differs from that of the sciences of inorganic nature. The common order of science proceeds from the details to the whole. The method of sociology should proceed from the whole to the details. There is no universal principle for the order of study, but that of proceeding from the known to the unknown, finding our way to the facts at whatever point is most open to our observation. In the phaenomena of the social state, the collective phenomenon is more accessible to us than the parts of which it is composed. This is already, in a great degree, true of the mere animal body. It is essential to the idea of an organism, and it is even more true of the social organism than of the individual. The state of every part of the social whole at any time is intimately connected with the contemporaneous state of all the others. Religious belief, philosophy, science, the fine arts, the industrial arts, commerce, navigation, government, all are in close mutual dependence on one another, insomuch that when any considerable change takes place in one, we may know that a parallel change in all the others has preceded or will follow it. The progress of society from one general state to another is not an aggregate of partial changes, but the product of a single impulse, acting through all the partial agencies, and can therefore be most easily traced by studying them together. Could it even be detected in them separately, its true nature could not be understood except by examining them in the ensemble. In constructing, therefore, a theory of society, all the different aspects of the social organization must be taken into consideration at once. Our space is not consistent with inquiring into all the limitations of this doctrine. It requires many of which M. Comte's theory takes no account. There is one in particular, dependent on a scientific artifice familiar to students of science, especially of the applications of mathematics to the study of nature. When an effect depends on several variable conditions, some of which change less or more slowly than others, we are often able to determine, either by reasoning or by experiment, what would be the law of variation of the effect if its changes depended only on some of the conditions, the remainder being supposed constant. The law so found will be sufficiently near the truth for all times and places in which the latter set of conditions do not vary greatly, and will be a basis to set out from when it becomes necessary to allow for the variations of those conditions also. Most of the conclusions of social science applicable to practical use are of this description. M. Comte's system makes no room for them. We have seen how he deals with the part of them which are the most scientific in character, the generalizations of political economy. There is one more point in the general philosophy of sociology requiring notice. Social phanomena, like all others, present two aspects, the statical and the dynamical, the phanomena of equilibrium and those of motion. The statical aspect is that of the laws of social existence, considered abstractedly from progress, and confined to what is common to the progressive and the stationary state. The dynamical aspect is that of social progress. The statics of society is the study of the conditions of existence and permanence of the social state. The dynamics studies the laws of its evolution. The first is the theory of the consensus, or interdependence of social phanomena. The second is the theory of their filiation. The first division M. Comte in his great work treats in a much more summary manner than the second, and it forms, to our thinking, the weakest part of the treatise. He can hardly have seemed, even to himself, to have originated, in the statics of society, anything new. Footnote: Indeed, his claim to be the creator of sociology does not extend to this branch of the science. On the contrary, he, in a subsequent work, expressly declares that the real founder of it was Aristotle, by whom the theory of the conditions of social existence was carried as far towards perfection as was possible in the absence of any theory of progress. Without going quite this length, we think it hardly possible to appreciate too highly the merit of those early efforts, beyond which little progress had been made, until a very recent period, either in ethical or in political science. Unless his revival of the Catholic idea of a spiritual power may be so considered. The remainder, with the exception of detached thoughts, in which even his feeblest productions are always rich, is trite, while in our judgment far from being always true. He begins by a statement of the general properties of human nature which make social existence possible. Man has a spontaneous propensity to the society of his fellow beings, and seeks it instinctively, for its own sake, and not out of regard to the advantages it procures for him, which in many conditions of humanity must appear to him very problematical. Man has also a certain, though moderate, amount of natural benevolence. On the other hand, these social propensities are by nature weaker than his selfish ones, and the social state, being mainly kept in existence through the former, involves an habitual antagonism between the two. Further, our wants of all kinds, from the purely organic upwards, can only be satisfied by means of labour, nor does bodily labour suffice, without the guidance of intelligence. But labour, especially when prolonged and monotonous, is naturally hateful, and mental labour the most irksome of all, and hence a second antagonism which must exist in all societies whatever. The character of the society is principally determined by the degree in which the better incentive, in each of these cases, makes head against the worse. In both the points, human nature is capable of great amelioration. The social instincts may approximate much nearer to the strength of the personal ones, though never entirely coming up to it. The aversion to labour in general and to intellectual labour in particular may be much weakened, and the predominance of the inclinations over the reason greatly diminished, though never completely destroyed. The spirit of improvement results from the increasing strength of the social instincts, combined with the growth of an intellectual activity, which, guiding the personal propensities, inspires each individual with a deliberate desire to improve his condition. The personal instincts left to their own guidance, and the indolence and apathy natural to mankind, are the sources which mainly feed the spirit of conservation. The struggle between the two spirits is an universal incident of the social state. The next of the universal elements in human society is family life, which M. Comte regards as originally the sole, and always the principal, source of the social feelings, and the only school open to mankind in general in which unselfishness can be learnt, and the feelings and conduct demanded by social relations be made habitual. M. Comte takes this opportunity of declaring his opinions on the proper constitution of the family, and in particular of the marriage institution. They are of the most orthodox and conservative sort. M. Comte adheres not only to the popular Christian, but to the Catholic view of marriage in its utmost strictness, and rebukes Protestant nations for having tampered with the indissolubility of the engagement by permitting divorce. He admits that the marriage institution has been in various respects beneficially modified with the advance of society, and that we may not yet have reached the last of these modifications, but strenuously maintains that such changes cannot possibly affect what he regards as the essential principles of the institution, the irrevocability of the engagement, and the complete subordination of the wife to the husband, and of women generally to men, which are precisely the great vulnerable points of the existing constitution of society on this important subject. It is unpleasant to have to say it of a philosopher, but the incidents of his life, which have been made public by his biographers, afford an explanation of one of these two opinions. He had quarrelled with his wife.
Footnote: it is due to them both to say, that he continued to express, in letters which have been published, a high opinion of her, both morally and intellectually, and her persistent and strong concern for his interests and his fame is attested both by M. Littré and by his own correspondence. At a later period, under the influence of circumstances equally personal, his opinions and feelings respecting women were very much modified, without becoming more rational. In his final scheme of society, instead of being treated as grown children, they were exalted into goddesses. Honours, privileges, and immunities were lavished on them, only not simple justice. On the other question, the irrevocability of marriage, M. Comte must receive credit for impartiality, since the opposite doctrine would have better suited his personal convenience. But we can give him no other credit, for his argument is not only futile, but refutes itself. He says that with liberty of divorce, life would be spent in a constant succession of experiments and failures, and in the same breath congratulates himself on the fact that modern manners and sentiments have in the main prevented the baneful effects which the toleration of divorce in Protestant countries might have been expected to produce. He did not perceive that if modern habits and feelings have successfully resisted what he deems the tendency of a less rigorous marriage law, it must be because modern habits and feelings are inconsistent with the perpetual series of new trials which he dreaded. If there are tendencies in human nature which seek change and variety, there are others which demand fixity, in matters which touch the daily sources of happiness, and one who had studied history as much as M. Comte ought to have known that ever since the nomad mode of life was exchanged for the agricultural, the latter tendencies have been always gaining ground on the former. All experience testifies that regularity in domestic relations is almost in direct proportion to industrial civilization. Idle life, and military life with its long intervals of idleness, are the conditions to which either sexual profligacy or prolonged vagaries of imagination on that subject are congenial. Busy men have no time for them, and have too much other occupation for their thoughts. They require that home should be a place of rest, not of incessantly renewed excitement and disturbance. In the condition, therefore, into which modern society has passed, there is no probability that marriages would often be contracted without a sincere desire on both sides that they should be permanent. That this has been the case hitherto in countries where divorce was permitted, we have on M. Comte's own showing, and everything leads us to believe that the power, if granted elsewhere, would in general be used only for its legitimate purpose, for enabling those who, by a blameless or excusable mistake, have lost their first throw for domestic happiness, to free themselves, with due regard for all interests concerned, from the burthensome yoke, and try, under more favorable auspices, another chance. Any further discussion of these great social questions would evidently be incompatible with the nature and limits of the present paper. Lastly, a phenomenon universal in all societies, and constantly assuming a wider extension as they advance in their progress,
is the co-operation of mankind one with another,
by the division of employments and interchange of commodities and services; a communion which extends to nations as well as individuals. The economic importance of this spontaneous organization of mankind as joint workers with and for one another has often been illustrated. Its moral effects, in connecting them by their interests, and as a more remote consequence by their sympathies, are equally salutary. But there are some things to be said on the other side. The increasing specialization of all employments, the division of mankind into innumerable small fractions, each engrossed by an extremely minute fragment of the business of society, is not without inconveniences, as well moral as intellectual, which, if they could not be remedied, would be a serious abatement from the benefits of advanced civilization. The interests of the whole, the bearings of things on the ends of the social union, are less and less present to the minds of men who have so contracted a sphere of activity. The insignificant detail which forms their whole occupation, the infinitely minute wheel they help to turn in the machinery of society, does not arouse or gratify any feeling of public spirit, or unity with their fellow men. Their work is a mere tribute to physical necessity, not the glad performance of a social office. This lowering effect of the extreme division of labour tells most of all on those who are set up as the lights and teachers of the rest. A man's mind is as fatally narrowed, and his feelings towards the great ends of humanity as miserably stunted, by giving all his thoughts to the classification of a few insects or the resolution of a few equations, as to sharpening the points or putting on the heads of pins. The dispersive specialty of the present race of scientific men, who, unlike their predecessors, have a positive aversion to enlarged views, and seldom either know or care for any of the interests of mankind beyond the narrow limits of their pursuit, is dwelt on by M. Comte as one of the great and growing evils of the time, and the one which most retards moral and intellectual regeneration. To contend against it is one of the main purposes toward which he thinks the forces of society should be directed. The obvious remedy is a large and liberal general education, preparatory to all special pursuits, and this is M. Comte's opinion. But the education of youth is not in his estimation enough. He requires an agency set apart for obtruding upon all classes of persons through the whole of life, the paramount claims of the general interest, and the comprehensive ideas that demonstrate the mode in which human actions promote or impair it. In other words, he demands a moral and intellectual authority, charged with the duty of guiding men's opinions and enlightening and warning their consciences; a spiritual power, whose judgments on all matters of high moment should deserve and receive the same universal respect and deference which is paid to the united judgment of astronomers in matters astronomical. The very idea of such an authority implies that an unanimity has been attained, at least in essentials, among moral and political thinkers, corresponding or approaching to that which already exists in the other sciences. There cannot be this unanimity until the true methods of positive science have been applied to all subjects, as completely as they have been applied to the study of physical science. To this, however, there is no real obstacle, and when once it is accomplished, the same degree of accordance will naturally follow. The undisputed authority which astronomers possess in astronomy will be possessed on the great social questions by positive philosophers, to whom will belong the spiritual government of society, subject to two conditions: that they be entirely independent within their own sphere of the temporal government, and that they be peremptorily excluded from all share in it, receiving instead the entire conduct of education. End of Part 1e. Recording by Bill Vorst.
Part 1f of Auguste Comte and Positivism. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Auguste Comte and Positivism, by John Stuart Mill. Part 1f. This is the leading feature in M. Comte's conception of a regenerated society. And however much this ideal differs from that which is implied more or less confusedly in the negative philosophy of the last 3 centuries, we hold the amount of truth in the two to be about the same. M. Comte has got hold of half the truth, and the so-called liberal or revolutionary school possesses the other half. Each sees what the other does not see, and seeing it exclusively, draws consequences from it which to the other appear mischievously absurd. It is, without doubt, the necessary condition of mankind to receive most of their opinions on the authority of those who have specially studied the matters to which they relate. The wisest can act on no other rule, on subjects with which they are not themselves thoroughly conversant, and the mass of mankind have always done the like on all the great subjects of thought and conduct, acting with implicit confidence on opinions of which they did not know, and were often incapable of understanding, the grounds, but on which as long as their natural guides were unanimous they fully relied, growing uncertain and sceptical only when these became divided, and teachers who as far as they could judge were equally competent, professed contradictory opinions. Any doctrines which come recommended by the nearly universal verdict of instructed minds will no doubt continue to be, as they have hitherto been, accepted without misgiving by the rest. The difference is, that with the wide diffusion of scientific education among the whole people, demanded by M. Comte, their faith, however implicit, would not be that of ignorance. It would not be the blind submission of dunces to men of knowledge, but the intelligent deference of those who know much to those who know still more. It is those who have some knowledge of astronomy, not those who have none at all, who best appreciate how prodigiously more Lagrange or Laplace knew than themselves. This is what can be said in favour of M. Comte. On the contrary side it is to be said, that in order that this salutary ascendancy over opinion should be exercised by the most eminent thinkers, it is not necessary that they should be associated and organized. The ascendancy will come of itself when the unanimity is attained, without which it is neither desirable nor possible. It is because astronomers agree in their teaching that astronomy is trusted, and not because there is an Academy of Sciences, or a Royal Society issuing decrees or passing resolutions. A constituted moral authority can only be required when the object is not merely to promulgate and diffuse principles of conduct, but to direct the detail of their application; to declare and inculcate, not duties, but each person's duty, as was attempted by the spiritual authority of the Middle Ages. From this extreme application of his principle M. Comte does not shrink. A function of this sort, no doubt, may often be very usefully discharged by individual members of the speculative class, but if entrusted to any organized body, would involve nothing less than a spiritual despotism. This, however, is what M. Comte really contemplated, though it would practically nullify that peremptory separation of the spiritual from the temporal power, which he justly deemed essential to a wholesome state of society. Those whom an irresistible public opinion invested with the right to dictate or control the acts of rulers, though without the means of backing their advice by force, would have all the real power of the temporal authorities, without their labours or their responsibilities. M. Comte would probably have answered that the temporal rulers, having the whole legal power in their hands, would certainly not pay to the spiritual authority more than a very limited obedience; which amounts to saying that the ideal form of society, which he sets up, is only fit to be an ideal because it cannot possibly be realized. That education should be practically directed by the philosophic class, when there is a philosophic class who have made good their claim to the place in opinion hitherto filled by the clergy, would be natural and indispensable, but that all education should be in the hands of a centralized authority, whether composed of clergy or of philosophers, and be consequently all framed on the same model, and directed to the perpetuation of the same type, is a state of things which, instead of becoming more acceptable, will assuredly be more repugnant to mankind, with every step of their progress in the unfettered exercise of their highest faculties. We shall see, in the second part, the evils with which the conception of the new spiritual power is pregnant, coming out into full bloom in the more complete development which M. Comte gave to the idea in his later years. After this unsatisfactory attempt to trace the outline of social statics, M. Comte passes to a topic on which he is much more at home, the subject of his most eminent speculations, social dynamics, or the laws of the evolution of human society. Two questions meet us at the outset. Is there a natural evolution in human affairs? And is that evolution an improvement? M. Comte resolves them both in the affirmative by the same answer. The natural progress of society consists in the growth of our human attributes, comparatively to our animal and our purely organic ones. The progress of our humanity towards an ascendancy over our animality, ever more nearly approached though incapable of being completely realized. This is the character and tendency of human development, or of what is called civilization, and the obligation of seconding this movement, of working in the direction of it, is the nearest approach which M. Comte makes in this treatise to a general principle or standard of morality. But as our more eminent and peculiarly human faculties are of various orders, moral, intellectual, and aesthetic, the question presents itself, is there any one of these whose development is the predominant agency in the evolution of our species? According to M. Comte, the main agent in the progress of mankind is their intellectual development. Not because the intellectual is the most powerful part of our nature, for, limited to its inherent strength, it is one of the weakest, but because it is the guiding part, and acts not with its own strength alone, but with the united force of all parts of our nature which it can draw after it. In a social state the feelings and propensities cannot act with their full power in a determinate direction, unless the speculative intellect places itself at their head. The passions are, in the individual man, a more energetic power than a mere intellectual conviction, but the passions tend to divide, not to unite mankind. It is only by a common belief that passions are brought to work together, and become a collective force instead of forces neutralizing one another. Our intelligence is first awakened by the stimulus of our animal wants and of our stronger and coarser desires, and these for a long time almost exclusively determine the direction in which our intelligence shall work. But once roused to activity, it assumes more and more the management of the operations of which stronger impulses are the prompters, and constrains them to follow its lead, not by its own strength, but because in the play of antagonistic forces the path it points out is, in scientific phraseology, the direction of least resistance. Personal interests and feelings, in the social state, can only obtain the maximum of satisfaction by means of co-operation, and the necessary condition of co-operation is a common belief. All human society, consequently, is grounded on a system of fundamental opinions, which only the speculative faculty can provide, and which, when provided, directs our other impulses in their mode of seeking their gratification. And hence the history of opinions, and of the speculative faculty, has always been the leading element in the history of mankind. This doctrine has been combated by Mr. Herbert Spencer in the pamphlet already referred to, and we will quote, in his own words, the theory he propounds in opposition to it. Ideas do not govern and overthrow the world. The world is governed or overthrown by feelings, to which ideas serve only as guides. The social mechanism does not rest finally upon opinions, but almost wholly upon character. Not intellectual anarchy, but moral antagonism, is the cause of political crises. All social phaemomena are produced by the totality of human emotions and beliefs, of which the emotions are mainly predetermined, while the beliefs are mainly postdetermined. Men's desires are chiefly inherited, but their beliefs are chiefly acquired, and depend on surrounding conditions, and the most important surrounding conditions depend on the social state which the prevalent desires have produced. The social state at any time existing is the resultant of all the ambitions, self-interests, fears, reverences, indignations, sympathies, etc., of ancestral citizens and existing citizens. The ideas current in this social state must, on the average, lie congruous with the feelings of citizens, and therefore, on the average, with the social state these feelings have produced. Ideas wholly foreign to this social state cannot be evolved, and if introduced from without cannot get accepted, or, if accepted, die out when the temporary phase of feeling which caused their acceptance ends. Hence, though advanced ideas, when once established, act upon society and aid its further advance, yet the establishment of such ideas depends on the fitness of society for receiving them. Practically, the popular character and the social state determine what ideas shall be current, instead of the current ideas determining the social state and the character. The modification of men's moral natures, caused by the continuous discipline of social life, which adapts them more and more to social relations, is therefore the chief proximate cause of social progress. Footnote of the classification of the sciences, pages 37 and 38. End footnote. A great part of these statements would have been acknowledged as true by M. Comte, and belong as much to his theory as to Mr. Spencer's. The reaction of all other mental and social elements upon the intellectual not only is fully recognized by him, but his philosophy of history makes great use of it, pointing out that the principal intellectual changes could not have taken place unless changes in other elements of society had preceded, but also showing that these were themselves consequences of prior intellectual changes. It will not be found, on a fair examination of what M. Comte has written, that he has overlooked any of the truth that there is in Mr. Spencer's theory. He would not indeed have said what Mr. Spencer apparently wishes us to say, that the effects which can be historically traced, for example to religion, were not produced by the belief in God, but by reverence and fear of him. He would have said that the reverence and fear presuppose the belief, that a God must be believed in before he can be feared or reverenced. The whole influence of the belief in a God upon society and civilization depends on the powerful human sentiments which are ready to attach themselves to the belief, and yet the sentiments are only a social force at all, through the definite direction given to them by that or some other intellectual conviction. Nor did the sentiments spontaneously throw up the belief in a God, since in themselves they were equally capable of gathering round some other object. Though it is true that men's passions and interests often dictate their opinions, or rather decide their choice among the 2 or 3 forms of opinion, which the existing condition of human intelligence renders possible, this disturbing cause is confined to morals, politics, and religion, and it is the intellectual movement in other regions than these which is at the root of all the great changes in human affairs. It was not human emotions and passions which discovered the motion of the earth, or detected the evidence of its antiquity, which exploded scholasticism, and inaugurated the exploration of nature, which invented printing paper and the mariner's compass. Yet the Reformation, the English and French revolutions, and still greater moral and social changes yet to come, are direct consequences of these and similar discoveries. Even alchemy and astrology were not believed because people thirsted for gold and were anxious to pry into the future, for these desires are as strong now as they were then, but because alchemy and astrology were conceptions natural to a particular stage in the growth of human knowledge, and consequently determined during that stage the particular means whereby the passions which always exist sought their gratification. To say that men's intellectual beliefs do not determine their conduct is like saying that the ship is moved by the steam and not by the steersman. The steam indeed is the motive power. The steersman, left to himself, could not advance the vessel a single inch. Yet it is the steersman's will and the steersman's knowledge which decide in what direction it shall move and whither it shall go. Examining next what is the natural order of intellectual progress among mankind, M. Comte observes that as their general mode of conceiving the universe must give its character to all their conceptions of detail, the determining fact in their intellectual history must be the natural succession of theories of the universe, which it has been seen consists of 3 stages: the theological, the metaphysical, and the positive. The passage of mankind through these stages, including the successive modifications of the theological conception by the rising influence of the other 2, is, to M. Comte's mind, the most decisive fact in the evolution of humanity. Simultaneously, however, there has been going on throughout history a parallel movement in the purely temporal department of things, consisting of the gradual decline of the military mode of life, originally the chief occupation of all freemen, and its replacement by the industrial. M. Comte maintains that there is a necessary connection and interdependence between this historical sequence and the other, and he easily shows that the progress of industry and that of positive science are correlative, man's power to modify the facts of nature evidently depending on the knowledge he has acquired of their laws. We do not think him equally successful in showing a natural connection between the theological mode of thought and the military system of society. But since they both belong to the same age of the world, since each is, in itself, natural and inevitable, and they are together modified and together undermined by the same cause, the progress of science and industry, M. Comte is justified in considering them as linked together, and the movement by which mankind emerge from them as a single evolution. These propositions having been laid down as the first principles of social dynamics, M. Comte proceeds to verify and apply them by a connected view of universal history. This survey nearly fills 2 large volumes, above a third of the work, in all of which there is scarcely a sentence that does not add an idea. We regard it as by far his greatest achievement, except his review of the science, and in some respects more striking even than that. We wish it were practicable, in the compass of an essay like the present, to give even a faint conception of the extraordinary merits of this historical analysis. It must be read to be appreciated. Whoever disbelieves that the philosophy of history can be made a science should suspend his judgment until he has read these volumes of M. Comte. We do not affirm that they would certainly change his opinion, but we would strongly advise him to give them a chance. We shall not attempt the vain task of abridgment. A few words are all we can give to the subject. M. Comte confines himself to the main stream of human progress, looking only at the races and nations that led the van, and regarding as the successors of a people not their actual descendants, but those who took up the thread of progress after them. His object is to characterize truly, though generally, the successive states of society through which the advanced guard of our species has passed, and the filiation of these states on one another, how each grew out of the preceding and was the parent of the following state. A more detailed explanation, taking into account minute differences and more special and local phenomena, M. Comte does not aim at, though he does not avoid it when it falls in his path. Here, as in all his other speculations, we meet occasional misjudgments, and his historical correctness in minor matters is now and then at fault. But we may well wonder that it is not oftener so, considering the vastness of the field, and a passage in one of his prefaces in which he says of himself that he rapidly amassed the materials for his great enterprise, 634. This expression in his mouth does not imply what it would in that of the majority of men, regard being had to his rare capacity of prolonged and concentrated mental labour, and it is wonderful that he so seldom gives cause to wish that his collection of materials had been less rapid. But, as he himself remarks, in an inquiry of this sort the vulgarest facts are the most important. A movement common to all mankind, to all of them at least who do move, must depend on causes affecting them all, and these, from the scale on which they operate, cannot require abstruse research to bring them to light. They are not only seen, but best seen in the most obvious, most universal, and most undisputed phenomena. Accordingly, M. Comte lays no claim to new views respecting the mere facts of history. He takes them as he finds them, builds almost exclusively on those concerning which there is no dispute, and only tries what positive results can be obtained by combining them. Among the vast mass of historical observations which he has grouped and coordinated, if we have found any errors, they are in things which do not affect his main conclusions. The chain of causation by which he connects the spiritual and temporal life of each era with one another and with the entire series, will be found, we think, in all essentials, irrefragable. When local or temporary disturbing causes have to be taken into the account as modifying the general movement, criticism has more to say. But this will only become important when the attempt is made to write the history or delineate the character of some given society on M. Comte's principles. Such doubtful statements, or misappreciations of states of society, as we have remarked, are confined to cases which stand more or less apart from the principal line of development of the progressive societies. For instance, he makes greatly too much of what, with many other continental thinkers, he calls the Theocratic State. He regards this as a natural, and at one time almost an universal, stage of social progress, though admitting that it either never existed, or speedily ceased in the two ancient nations to which mankind are chiefly indebted for being permanently progressive. We hold it doubtful if there ever existed what M. Comte means by a theocracy. There was indeed no lack of societies in which, the civil and penal law being supposed to have been divinely revealed, the priests were its authorized interpreters. But this is the case even in Mussulman countries, the extreme opposite of theocracy. By a theocracy we understand to be meant, and we understand M. Comte to mean, a society founded on caste, and in which the speculative, necessarily identical with the priestly caste, has the temporal government in its hands or under its control. We believe that no such state of things ever existed in the societies commonly cited as theocratic. There is no reason to think that in any of them, the king, or chief of the government, was ever, unless by occasional usurpation, a member of the priestly caste. In the case of Egypt, we admit that there may be cited against us the authority of Plato, in whose Politicus it is said that the king of Egypt must be a member of the priestly caste, or if by usurpation a member of any other caste acquired the sovereignty, he must be initiated with the sacerdotal order. But Plato was writing of a state of things which already belonged to the past. Nor have we any assurance that his information on Egyptian institutions was authentic and accurate. Had the king been necessarily or commonly a member of the priestly order, it is most improbable that the careful Herodotus, of whose comprehensive work an entire book was devoted to a minute account of Egypt and its institutions, and who collected his information from Egyptian priests in the country itself, would have been ignorant of a part so important, and tending so much to exalt the dignity of the priesthood, who were much more likely to affirm it falsely to Plato than to withhold the knowledge of it, if true, from Herodotus. Not only is Herodotus silent respecting any such law or custom, but he thinks it needful to mention that in one particular instance the king, by name Sethos, was a priest, which he would scarcely have done if this had been other than an exceptional case. It is likely enough that a king of Egypt would learn the hieratic character, and would not suffer any of the mysteries of law or religion which were in the keeping of the priests to be withheld from him, and this was very probably all the foundation which existed for the assertion of the Eleatic stranger in Plato's dialogue. It was not so in Israel, even in the time of the Judges. Jephthah, for example, was a Gileadite, of the tribe of Manasseh, and a military captain, as all governors in such an age and country needed to be. Priestly rulers only present themselves in two anomalous cases, of which next to nothing is known: the Mikados of Japan and the Grand Lamas of Tibet. In neither of which instances was the general constitution of society one of caste, and in the latter of them the priestly sovereignty is as nominal as it has become in the former. India is the typical specimen of the institution of caste, the only case in which we are certain that it ever really existed, for its existence anywhere else is a matter of more or less probable inference in the remote past. But in India, where the importance of the sacerdotal order was greater than in any other recorded state of society, the king not only was not a priest, but, consistently with the religious law, could not be one. He belonged to a different caste. The Brahmins were invested with an exalted character of sanctity, and an enormous amount of civil privileges. The king was enjoined to have a council of Brahmin advisers, but practically he took their advice or disregarded it, exactly as he pleased, as is observed by the historian who first threw the light of reason on Hindu society. Mill, History of British India, Book 2, Chapter 3. The king, though in dignity, to judge by the written code, he seemed vastly inferior to the Brahmins, had always the full power of a despotic monarch, the reason being that he had the command of the army, and the control of the public revenue. There is no case known to authentic history in which either of these belonged to the sacerdotal caste. Even in the cases most favourable to them, the priesthood had no voice in temporal affairs, except the consultative voice which M. Comte's theory allows to every spiritual power. His collection of materials must have been unusually rapid in this instance, for he regards almost all the societies of antiquity, except the Greek and Roman, as theocratic, even Gaul under the Druids, and Persia under Darius, admitting, however, that in these two countries, when they emerge into the light of history, the theocracy had already been much broken down by military usurpation. By what evidence he could have proved that it ever existed, we confess ourselves unable to divine. The only other imperfection worth noticing here, which we find in M. Comte's view of history, is that he has a very insufficient understanding of the peculiar phenomena of English development. Though he recognizes, and on the whole correctly estimates, its exceptional character in relation to the general European movement, his failure consists chiefly in want of appreciation of Protestantism, which, like almost all thinkers, even unbelievers, who have lived and thought exclusively in a Catholic atmosphere, he sees and knows only on its negative side, regarding the Reformation as a mere destructive movement, stopped short in too early a stage. He does not seem to be aware that Protestantism has any positive influences, other than the general ones of Christianity, and misses one of the most important facts connected with it, its remarkable efficacy, as contrasted with Catholicism, in cultivating the intelligence and conscience of the individual believer. Protestantism, when not merely professed but actually taken into the mind, makes a demand on the intelligence. The mind is expected to be active, not passive, in the reception of it. The feeling of a direct responsibility of the individual immediately to God is almost wholly a creation of Protestantism. Even when Protestants were nearly as persecuting as Catholics, quite as much so they never were, even when they held as firmly as Catholics that salvation depended on having the true belief, they still maintained that the belief was not to be accepted from a priest, but to be sought and found by the believer, at his eternal peril if he failed, and that no one could answer to God for him, but that he had to answer for himself. The avoidance of fatal error thus became in a great measure a question of culture, and there was the strongest inducement to every believer, however humble, to seek culture and to profit by it. In those Protestant countries, accordingly, whose churches were not, as the Church of England always was, principally political institutions, in Scotland, for instance, and the New England States, an amount of education was carried down to the poorest of the people, of which there is no other example. Every peasant expounded the Bible to his family, many to their neighbours, and had a mind practised in meditation and discussion on all the points of his religious creed. The food may not have been the most nourishing, but we cannot be blind to the sharpening and strengthening exercise which such great topics gave to the understanding, the discipline in abstraction and reasoning which such mental occupation brought down to the humblest layman, and one of the consequences of which was the privilege long enjoyed by Scotland of supplying the greater part of Europe with professors for its universities, and educated and skilled workmen for its practical arts. End of Part 1F. Recording by Bill Borst. Part 1G of Auguste Comte and Positivism. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Auguste Comte and Positivism, by John Stuart Mill. Part 1G. This, however, notwithstanding its importance, is, in a comprehensive view of universal history, only a matter of detail. We find no fundamental errors in M. Comte's general conception of history. He is singularly exempt from most of the twists and exaggerations which we are used to find in almost all thinkers who meddle with speculations of this character. Scarcely any of them is so free, for example, from the opposite errors of ascribing too much or too little influence to accident, and to the qualities of individuals. The vulgar mistake of supposing that the course of history has no tendencies of its own, and that great events usually proceed from small causes, or that kings, or conquerors, or the founders of philosophies and religions can do with society what they please, no one has more completely avoided or more tellingly exposed. But he is equally free from the error of those who ascribe all to general causes, and imagine that neither casual circumstances, nor governments by their acts, nor individuals of genius by their thoughts, materially accelerate or retard human progress. This is the mistake which pervades the instructive writings of the thinker who in England and in our own times bore the nearest, though a very remote, resemblance to M. Comte, the lamented Mr. Buckle, who, had he not been unhappily cut off in an early stage of his labours, and before the complete maturity of his powers, would probably have thrown off an error, the more to be regretted as it gives a colour to the prejudice which regards the doctrine of the invariability of natural laws as identical with fatalism. Mr. Buckle also fell into another mistake, which M. Comte avoided, that of regarding the intellectual as the only progressive element in man, and the moral as too much the same at all times to affect even the annual average of crime. M. Comte shows, on the contrary, a most acute sense of the causes which elevate or lower the general level of moral excellence, and deems intellectual progress in no other way so beneficial as by creating a standard to guide the moral sentiments of mankind, and a mode of bringing those sentiments effectively to bear on conduct. M. Comte is equally free from the error of considering any practical rule or doctrine that can be laid down in politics as universal and absolute. All political truth he deems strictly relative, implying as its correlative a given state or situation of society. This conviction is now common to him with all thinkers who are on a level with the age, and comes so naturally to any intelligent reader of history, that the only wonder is how men could have been prevented from reaching it sooner. It marks one of the principal differences between the political philosophy of the present time and that of the past. But M. Comte adopted it when the opposite mode of thinking was still general, and there are few thinkers to whom the principle owes more in the way of comment and illustration. Again, while he sets forth the historical succession of systems of belief and forms of political society, and places in the strongest light those imperfections in each which make it impossible that any of them should be final, this does not make him for a moment unjust to the men or the opinions of the past. He accords with generous recognition the gratitude due to all who, with whatever imperfections of doctrine or even of conduct, contributed materially to the work of human improvement. In all past modes of thought and forms of society he acknowledged a useful, in many a necessary, office, in carrying mankind through one stage of improvement into a higher. The theological spirit in its successive forms, the metaphysical in its principal varieties, are honoured by him for the services they rendered in bringing mankind out of pristine savagery into a state in which more advanced modes of belief became possible. His list of heroes and benefactors of mankind includes not only every important name in the scientific movement, from Thales of Miletus to Fourier the mathematician, and Blainville the biologist, and in the aesthetic from Homer to Manzoni, but the most illustrious names in the annals of the various religions and philosophies, and the really great politicians in all states of society. At a somewhat later period, M. Comte drew up what he termed a Positivist calendar, in which every day was dedicated to some benefactor of humanity, generally with the addition of a similar but minor luminary, to be celebrated in the room of his principal each bisextile year. In this no kind of human eminence really useful is omitted, except that which is merely negative and destructive. On this principle which is avowed, the French philosophes as such are excluded, those only among them being admitted who, like Voltaire and Diderot, had claims to admission on other grounds, and the Protestant religious reformers are left out entirely, with the curious exception of George Fox, who is included, we presume, in consideration of his peace principles. Above all, he has the most profound admiration for the services rendered by Christianity, and by the Church of the Middle Ages. His estimate of the Catholic period is such as the majority of Englishmen, from whom we take the liberty to differ, would deem exaggerated, if not absurd. The great men of Christianity, from St. Paul to St. Francis of Assisi, receive his warmest homage. Nor does he forget the greatness even of those who lived and thought in the centuries in which the Catholic Church, having stopped short while the world had gone on, had become a hindrance to progress instead of a promoter of it. Such men as Fénelon and St. Vincent de Paul, Bossuet, and Joseph de Maistre. A more comprehensive, and, in the primitive sense of the term, more catholic sympathy and reverence towards real worth, and every kind of service to humanity, we have not met with in any thinker. Men who would have torn each other in pieces, who even tried to do so, if each usefully served in his own way the interests of mankind, are all hallowed to him. Neither is his a cramped and contracted notion of human excellence, which cares only for certain forms of development. He not only personally appreciates, but rates high in moral value, the creations of poets and artists in all departments, deeming them, by their mixed appeal to the sentiments and the understanding, admirably fitted to educate the feelings of abstract thinkers and enlarge the intellectual horizon of people of the world. He goes still further and deeper in a subsequent work. L'art ramène doucement à la réalité les contemplations trop abstraites du théoricien, tandis qu'il pousse noblement le praticien aux spéculations désintéressées. Système de politique positive, 1-87. He regards the law of progress as applicable, in spite of appearances, to poetry and art as much as to science and politics. The common impression to the contrary he ascribes solely to the fact that the perfection of aesthetic creation requires as its condition a consentaneousness in the feelings of mankind, which depends for its existence on a fixed and settled state of opinions, while the last 5 centuries have been a period not of settling, but of unsettling and decomposing, the most general beliefs and sentiments of mankind. The numerous monuments of poetic and artistic genius which the modern mind has produced even under this great disadvantage, are, he maintains, sufficient proof what great productions it will be capable of, when one harmonious vein of sentiments shall once more thrill through the whole of society, as in the days of Homer, Aeschylus, of Phidias, and even of Dante. After so profound and comprehensive a view of the progress of human society in the past, of which the future can only be a prolongation, it is natural to ask, to what use does he put this survey as a basis of practical recommendations? Such recommendations he certainly makes, though, in the present treatise, they are of a much less definite character than in his later writings. But we miss a necessary link. There is a break in the otherwise close concatenation of his speculations. We fail to see any scientific connection between his theoretical explanation of the past progress of society and his proposals for future improvement. The proposals are not, as we might expect, recommended as that towards which human society has been tending and working through the whole of history. It is thus that thinkers have usually proceeded who formed theories for the future, grounded on historical analysis of the past. Tocqueville, for example, and others, finding, as they thought, through all history a steady progress in the direction of social and political equality, argued that to smooth this transition, and make the best of what is certainly coming, is the proper employment of political foresight. We do not find M. Comte supporting his recommendations by a similar line of argument. They rest as completely, each on its separate reasons of supposed utility, as with philosophers who, like Bentham, theorize on politics without any historical basis at all. The only bridge of connection which leads from his historical speculations to his practical conclusions is the inference that since the old powers of society, both in the region of thought and of action, are declining and destined to disappear, leaving only the 2 rising powers, positive thinkers on the one hand, leaders of industry on the other, the future necessarily belongs to these. spiritual power to the former, temporal to the latter. As a specimen of historical forecast, this is very deficient. For are there not the masses as well as the leaders of industry? And is not theirs also a growing power? Be this as it may, M. Comte's conceptions of the mode in which these growing powers should be organized and used are grounded on anything rather than on history. And we cannot but remark a singular anomaly in a thinker of M. Comte's calibre, after the ample evidence he has brought forward of the slow growth of the sciences, all of which except the mathematical astronomical couple are still, as he justly thinks, in a very early stage, it yet appears as if, to his mind, the mere institution of a positive science of sociology were tantamount to its completion; as if all the diversities of opinion on the subject which set mankind at variance were solely owing to its having been studied in the theological or the metaphysical manner; and as if when the positive method which has raised up real sciences on other subjects of knowledge is similarly employed on this, divergence would at once cease, and the entire body of positive social inquirers would exhibit as much agreement in their doctrines as those who cultivate any of the sciences of inorganic life. Happy would be the prospects of mankind if this were so. A time such as M. Comte reckoned upon may come. Unless something stops the progress of human improvement, it is sure to come, but after an unknown duration of hard thought and violent controversy. The period of decomposition which has lasted, on his own computation, from the beginning of the 14th century to the present, is not yet terminated. The shell of the old edifice will remain standing until there is another ready to replace it, and the new synthesis is barely begun, nor is even the preparatory analysis completely finished. On other occasions M. Comte is very well aware that the method of a science is not the science itself, and that when the difficulty of discovering the right processes has been overcome, there remains a still greater difficulty, that of applying them. This, which is true of all sciences, is truest of all in sociology. The facts being more complicated, and depending on a greater concurrence of forces than in any other science, the difficulty of treating them deductively is proportionally increased, while the wide difference between any one case and every other in some of the circumstances which affect the result makes the pretence of direct induction usually no better than empiricism. It is, therefore, out of all proportion, more uncertain than in any other science, whether two inquirers equally competent and equally disinterested will take the same view of the evidence, or arrive at the same conclusion. When to this intrinsic difficulty is added the infinitely greater extent to which personal or class interests and predilections interfere with impartial judgment, the hope of such accordance of opinion among sociological inquirers as would obtain, in more deference to their authority, the universal assent which M. Comte's scheme of society requires, must be adjourned to an indefinite distance. M. Comte's own theory is an apt illustration of these difficulties, since, though prepared for these speculations as no one had ever been prepared before, his views of social regeneration, even in the rudimentary form in which they appear above ground in this treatise, not to speak of the singular system into which he afterwards enlarged them, are such as perhaps no other person of equal knowledge and capacity would agree in. Were those views as true as they are questionable, they could not take effect until the unanimity among positive thinkers, to which he looked forward, shall have been attained, since the main stream of his system is a spiritual power composed of positive philosophers, which only the previous attainment of the unanimity in question could call into existence. A few words will sufficiently express the outline of his scheme. A corporation of philosophers receiving a modest support from the state, surrounded by reverence, but peremptorily excluded not only from all political power or employment, but from all riches, and all occupations except their own, are to have the entire direction of education, together with, not only the right and duty of advising and reproving all persons respecting both their public and their private life, but also a control, whether authoritative or only moral is not defined, over the speculative class itself, to prevent them from wasting time and ingenuity on inquiries and speculations of no value to mankind, among which he includes many now in high estimation, and compel them to employ all their powers on the investigations which may be judged, at the time, to be the most urgently important to the general welfare. The temporal government which is to coexist with this spiritual authority consists of an aristocracy of capitalists, whose dignity and authority are to be in the ratio of the degree of generality of their conceptions and operations, bankers at the summit, merchants next, and then manufacturers and agriculturalists at the bottom of the scale. No representative system, or other popular organization, by way of counterpoise to this governing power, is ever contemplated. The checks relied upon for preventing its abuse are the counsels and remonstrances of the spiritual power, and unlimited liberty of discussion and comment by all classes of inferiors. Of the mode in which either set of authorities should fulfil the office assigned to it, little is said in this treatise. But the general idea is, while regulating as little as possible by law, to make the pressure of opinion directed by the spiritual power so heavy on every individual, from the humblest to the most powerful, as to render legal obligation, in as many cases as possible, needless. Liberty and spontaneity on the part of individuals form no part of the scheme. M. Comte looks on them with as great jealousy as any scholastic pedagogue, or ecclesiastical director of consciences. Every particular of conduct, public or private, is to be open to the public eye, and to be kept by the power of opinion in the course which the spiritual corporation shall judge to be the most right. This is not a sufficiently tempting picture to have much chance of making converts rapidly, and the objections to the scheme are too obvious to need stating. Indeed, it is only thoughtful persons to whom it will be credible that speculations leading to this result can deserve the attention necessary for understanding them. We propose in the next essay to examine them as part of the elaborate and coherent system of doctrine, which M. Comte afterwards put together for the reconstruction of society. Meanwhile, the reader will gather from what has been said that M. Comte has not, in our opinion, created sociology. Except his analysis of history, to which there is much to be added, but which we do not think likely to be ever, in its general features, superseded, he has done nothing in sociology which does not require to be done over again, and better. Nevertheless, he has greatly advanced the study. Besides the great stores of thought of various and often eminent merit, with which he has enriched the subject, his conception of its method is so much truer and more profound than that of any one who preceded him, as to constitute an era in its cultivation. If it cannot be said of him that he has created a science, it may be said truly that he has, for the first time, made the creation possible. This is a great achievement, and with the extraordinary merit of his historical analysis, and of his philosophy of the physical sciences, is enough to immortalize his name. But his renown with posterity would probably have been greater than it is now likely to be, if after showing the way in which the social science should be formed, he had not flattered himself that he had formed it, and that it was already sufficiently solid for attempting to build upon its foundation the entire fabric of the political art. End of Part 1G. Recording by Bill Borst.